Up next, author Malcolm Mackay discusses his book, Impeccable Connections, The Rise and Fall of Richard Whitney. He details Mr. Whitney's journey from president of the New York Stock Exchange to convicted white-collar criminal. New York City's Museum of American Finance hosted this hour-long event.
I'm David Cowan, president of the Museum of American Finance. Welcome back to Lunch and Learn. Our core mission here is to preserve, exhibit, and teach about the nation's finances and financial history, and we are a Smithsonian affiliate. We're joined today by our founder and chairman emeritus, John Herzog, and I always like to point him out. Thank you for joining us, John. Now, we have to teach financial history and how we in America love a financial scandal. And we're going to learn about one today about Richard Whitney, and he, for his day, was a combination of Charles Ponzi and Bernie Madoff. If you can believe that, this was very high profile. Our author, Malcolm Mackay, is a lawyer and businessman, and as a boy and young man, he actually knew Richard Whitney personally in his post-prison days. You'll sure hear about that. He's written for the New York Times Magazine and for Business Week. He's a graduate of Princeton University and Harvard Law School. Now, we have an artifact upstairs that is on the exhibit floor, which is a newspaper which is germane to today's discussion. It says Stock Market Crisis Over, and it's from 4 days before the Great Crash, Friday, because the Thursday preceding, the market had fallen 11%, but a combination of banks, and you're going to hear about this, I'm sure, acting through Richard Whitney as their agent on the floor, stabilized that, leading to this famous headline that's reminiscent of Dewey defeats Truman. We know, of course, 4 days later what's going to happen. And so let's hear about that tale from Malcolm Mackay. The book, Impeccable Connections. Thank you. Thank you. The book will be on sale afterwards.
I would like to thank everyone for coming today. Maybe particularly, especially my neighbors from our hood, which is just across the river, one subway stop away, classmates from various places, work and volunteer colleagues, and of course friends. David, I'd like to thank you, and also Kristen Anguilera, for all your hospitality and the consideration. And I was going to also mention John Herzog, who had the imagination to think this thing up and then the drive to create it. And it really is filling an important role in the development of American history, because most historians until recently have not dealt with finance. It's something they're not familiar with, and it's a whole area, a huge area that this museum is helping to focus on, and doing a terrific job. I'd also like to mention John Colby, my publisher, a very daring man. Where is he? Seriously? Daring, or some other verb could be used to describe this. And I'm very grateful to him. You were going to hear about a relatively short book about someone very few people have ever heard of, by someone who's never written a book. And if you leave right now, you probably could get back to the office before the end of lunch hour. So I understand. What I'd like to do is to begin with some prepared remarks concerning the facts of the story, follow with a few photographs, and then open it up for discussion. And I would hope in the discussion we could deal with the human side of the story, which is by far the most interesting side. The Roaring Twenties were never louder than at the southwest corner of Wall and Broad, home of the New York Stock Exchange, especially as summer turned to fall in 1929. The Dow rose to 381 on September 3rd, a six-fold increase over the decade, and a record high that would stand without adjusting for inflation for the next quarter century. The following 7 weeks were marked by an unusual price volatility, but there were few indeed who anticipated what was to come. Come it did on October 24th, a day that has gone down in history as Black Thursday. Prices collapsed from the opening bell. Winston Churchill, Jay, hi, grab a seat. Winston Churchill who happened to be in the visitors gallery that morning, was amazed at the chaos as he looked down at the trading floor. A large, silent crowd gathered on the street outside, and an air of panic grew as in direct proportion to the stock ticker falling further and further behind. Would the cavalry come to the rescue? As the Trinity Church bells rang out at noon, several well-known bankers worked their way through the crowd and entered 23 Wall Street, the unmarked offices of the J.P. Morgan Company, the Morgan Bank. The bankers didn't stay long, and then Morgan's senior partner, Tom Lamont, met the press. Quote, "There has been a little distress selling on the stock exchange," he said, in what would later be described as one of the most remarkable understatements of all time. "And we have held a meeting of the heads of several financial institutions to discuss the situation." At 1:30, representing the angel bankers, Richard Whitney, and there he is in 1929, in that photograph, age 40, acting president of the exchange and Morgan's primary bondbroker, strode on the trading floor. He was 6 feet tall, exquisitely dressed. All eyes were on him, and no one spoke. Confident, even jaunty, according to one report, he went directly to the U.S. Steel specialist and, in a strong voice, offered $205, the last sales price, but well above the offering price for 10,000 shares. And he proceeded to the other trading posts, also bidding at the prices of the last sale. Whitney's intervention seemed to work. By day's end, the market was off only 12 points. As one headline put it the next day, "Richard Whitney halts stock panic." Prices held firm on Friday and Saturday, only to collapse the next week, absent any additional support from the bankers. Although the success of his intervention was fleeting, Whitney emerged as something of an heroic figure. With impeccable social connections and patrician style, he was elected without opposition to the presidency of the exchange the following spring and re-elected annually for 4 more terms. He became a national spokesman for the securities industry, the national spokesman really, often testifying in Washington, speaking across the country, and appearing in a movie house news clips. CBS and NBC carried his speeches on national radio, which was a new thing then, and in 1934 he was on the cover of Time magazine. There was even talk of him becoming the Republican candidate for president against Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. And in 1940, of course, the Republicans did nominate a businessman who had opposed the Tennessee Valley Authority. Things were not, however, as they appeared. While the public Whitney flourished, the private Whitney self-destructed. He lived beyond his means. He invested terribly. He borrowed more and more. He stole securities that had been entrusted to him. Flash forward to March 1938, and we find him being booked at the Elizabeth Street police station for the embezzlement of funds. He admits everything and assumes sole responsibility for his acts. Simon Breen, the police lieutenant at the desk, says, "Mr. Whitney, I'm sorry to see you in this trouble, and I wish you luck." "Thank you," replies Whitney, and they shake hands. My father once said that, with the exception of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the most shocking thing he had ever heard was that Richard Whitney was a crook. Others had similar reactions. According to Nancy Randolph, the society columnist for the Daily News, quote, "Not in our time, in our father's time, nor in our grandfather's time has there been such a social debacle. He had no need to overreach himself for power, for money, or for social position. He had them all." Time, in an issue just after his arrest, observed, "The terrible thing about the Whitney scandal is that the broker was the white knight of the financial district. Whitney was Sir Richard when he went to battle in shining armor against the 1929 crash and again when he stood up and defied Washington and the reformers. Now it turns out that this great white knight was an optical illusion. My closest friend, childhood friend, who died in a car accident his freshman year at Harvard, was Richard Whitney's grandson. From my friend's death in 1960 until Whitney's own 14 years later, we kept in regular touch, abetted by the fact that he lived his final years in literally down the road from my in-laws in New Jersey. He had been given a cottage by Clarence Dillon, of Dillon Reed, after he got out of prison. And I felt considerable affection for both him and Mrs. Whitney, who never flagged in her support of her husband. Arriving at my engagement party in 1963, Whitney grabbed my hand in his too, and he said, "I want to thank you, Malcolm. This is the first time I've been in society since my troubles." I've thought about Richard Whitney and why he did what he did all my life, and my book tells his story. The years of Whitney's presidency of the Exchange, 1930, 1935, were difficult ones, obviously, for Wall Street and the entire country. By year-end 1932, stock prices had fallen 89% from their 1929 high, and unemployment had reached 25%. The Democrats took control of the House of Representatives in 1930, and they took control of the Senate 2 years later when Franklin Roosevelt became president. Washington wanted to reform Wall Street, and Wall Street wanted to be left alone. You may think there's some relevance to today, but initially, there's a lot of relevance to this whole story. Initially, Whitney was effective in making the case against federal securities regulation. In 1932, after he testified for 9 consecutive days as the lead witness before the Senate Banking Committee, he was portrayed in a cartoon as a teacher with the senators as schoolchildren. In early 1933, however, the committee hired a new counsel, Ferdinand Pecora, the son of a Sicilian cobbler. He moved quickly to expose abuses in the banking and securities industries to a largely unsuspecting public. Called again before the committee, this time Whitney didn't do so well. One senator complaining of his self-importance and righteous attitude. During FDR's first 100 days, Congress passed both the Securities Act of 1933, imposing disclosure requirements on the industry, and the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, mandating the separation of investment and commercial banking. The passage of the 1933 Securities Act was a defeat for Wall Street, but one it could survive. The proposed Securities Exchange Act of 1934, creating the Securities and Exchange Commission as a regulatory agency for the industry, was another matter. Whitney led the attack on the proposed act, and his message was simple. The securities industry should regulate itself, and the federal government should stay out. He fought all out, using arguments and language strikingly similar to the logic and rhetoric of today's opponents of federal oversight. Government regulation impedes economic activity. Markets are self-correcting. Beware of the slippery slope to socialism. He predicted that the passage of the 1934 Act would turn Manhattan into a deserted Lower Manhattan into a deserted village. Not content to speak against reform, Whitney organized a national lobbying effort, complete with letter writing, rallies, and delegations converging on Washington. The Exchange rented a house in Washington that was known locally as the Wall Street Embassy. One letter from Whitney to the business community asked, "Are your employees alive to the fact that with the passage of the bill, a great many of them will be out of employment?" FDR himself was impressed with the ferocity of Whitney's campaign. And there's a quote from FDR, "A more definite and highly organized drive is being made against effective legislation than against any similar recommendations made by me." The passage of the 34 Act didn't end the debate. The Act not only created the SEC, But it also gave it virtually unlimited authority to set the rules by which the security industry would operate. In effect, Congress, as it often and does when it creates a regulatory agency, empowered the SEC to decide its own rules, to define its own rules. Thus, the battle over the SEC, if anything, intensified under both the first commissioner, Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president, and the third, William O. Douglas, the later of the Supreme Court. With Whitney and Kennedy, it was Boston Brahmin versus Irish Catholic upstart. With Douglas, it was establishment businessman versus liberal professor. Whitney fought against virtually everything the SEC wanted to achieve, even to the point of criticizing Kennedy's every public statement. He blamed the decline in the issuance of new stock and corporate bonds and a parallel decline in the securities sales on federal regulation and fear of more to come. Not many outside his inner circle saw it that way. Over time, Whitney began to lose support, not only with the general public, but even with his fellow exchange members. He had a tin ear for the movement of public opinion toward reasonable regulation. Maybe just as significant, his obvious sense of his own social superiority, which he never made any attempt to hide, or much less temper, began to grate on others. The 1930s was still a time when people were comfortable, or was it resigned, to defer to their social betters. But there were limits. The bedrock of Whitney's support among exchange members was the old guard of specialists who made a market in a given company's shares, and private traders who used their membership to trade for their own accounts. And I think about a quarter of the exchange members at the time were really only traded on their own accounts. Both groups benefited from inside information about trading activities in specific companies, not available to outsiders. Increasingly, the power within the exchange was shifting to the retail brokers serving the national markets, the future Merrill Lynchers. These brokers realized that their business depended on the exchange being perceived as fair and transparent and not subject to the manipulation of a few. In the spring of 1935, the Exchange's nominating committee, over the strenuous objection of the old guard, decided not to nominate Whitney for a sixth annual term as president. He was re-elected overwhelmingly as a governor or member of the governing committee, and was also made a trustee of the Stock Exchange Gratuity Fund, which was an insurance program for the benefit of the families of deceased members. He continued to lead the opposition to the SEC effort to transform the exchange from a private club to a public institution. The SEC, with growing support among exchange members, focused on several proposals: elimination of private trading, strict control of short selling, limits on margin trading, creation of the depository trust company to hold security certificates, and clear rules concerning the role of specialists. As for exchange governance, Douglas in particular was adamant: replace the volunteer president. Whitney and all the predecessors were volunteers. As presidents of the exchange, and member-only governance structure with a paid chief executive, independent staff, and a board with some members representing the public. It took the reformers until early 1938 to achieve their goals, with Whitney untiring, if increasingly less effective, in opposition. In January of that year, a decisive meeting of the exchange governors, Charles Gay, Whitney's unassuming successor as exchange president, who was presiding officer, was not expected to speak, stepped down from the rostrum to the well of the governor's room and made his position clear. Reform was inevitable, and the only remaining issue was whether it would be imposed by government or initiated by the exchange itself. It was the first time Gay had opposed Whitney in public. Whitney argued for delay, but no one spoke in support. And from that point on, January 1938, reform had won. The public Whitney was a poster boy for the old American establishment. While his family were comfortable in old Massachusetts, It was not wealthy or particularly distinguished. It was more Calvin Coolidge than Henry Cabot Lodge. His father had risen from a clerk at age 17 to a successful importer and banker. Richard followed his older brother George to Groton, Harvard, and the college's socially elite Porcellian Club, and Wall Street. George was to head Morgan eventually, while Richard was the bank's primary bond broker. Both would marry wealthy women, very wealthy in George's case, and own Manhattan townhouses and grand country estates. Richard would become president of one of his many clubs, the Lynx, treasurer of the New York Yacht Club, and a member of and the master of the hunt in fox hunt in Far Hills, New Jersey, where he had a 500-acre estate with really a horse and cattle farm. At his 25th reunion in 1936, he was elected the second most successful classmate, the top billing going to a well-known New Yorker cartoonist. His classmates would learn just 2 years later, and to their total dismay, that they were wrong about Whitney. Everybody was. In early 1933, Whitney thought he had found the path to riches. Anticipating the repeal of Prohibition, he helped organize the Distilled Liquors Corporation, consisting of several small local distilleries whose main product was called Jersey Lightning. It was really Applejack, or apple brandy, if you will, if you insist. The drink was popular in New Jersey hunt country during Prohibition, and Whitney was certain it would sweep the country when sales became legal, as they did in December 1933. For a while, yeah, and it's interesting, Joe Kennedy had the same idea, but he invested in the Haig & Haig. For a while, distilled liquors looked like a winner. By the spring of 1934, its share prices had tripled from 15 to 45. Whitney used the stock he already owned as collateral for bank loans to buy more. After its early run-up, the share prices, however, began a long decline, which caused the leading banks to require more and more collateral. Whitney could not produce. His solution was to peg or support the share price at around $10 by buying shares that otherwise would have been sold at below that peg. So, and when the distilled liquor stock got down to 10, Whitney would buy rather than let it go lower. Pegging, of course, required more and more cash, as Whitney and his firm became virtually the sole buyer, and they ended up, by early 1938, as almost the total owner of the company. Cash, cash, cash. Whitney needed new loans to pay down old loans. In his impersonal, matter-of-fact way, he took to soliciting loans from people he barely knew, including exchange members he had all but ignored previously. Many responded positively to his solicitations, although there were also, and increasingly, rejections. Sidney Weinberg, later to head Goldman Sachs, told Whitney no, but he may have been influenced by the fact that Whitney addressed him as Weinstein. Selim Ben Smith, a notorious stock manipulator and pool operator in the 1920s, quite close to Joe Kennedy and Michael Meehan, also said no. Poor Irish Catholic boy who hated Whitney's Brahmin style. Smith would recall later that Whitney had asked him to borrow $250,000 on my face, that is, without collateral. Smith said, quote, "I remarked that he was putting a pretty high value on his face. I told him that he had a lot of nerve to ask me for $250,000 when he didn't even bid me the time of day." In one 4-month period, Whitney borrowed 111 times for amounts totaling over $27 million, taking out one loan to pay back another loan, and over again. Try as he might, Whitney couldn't keep up with his cash needs. For many years, he had occasionally taken, or borrowed, as he may have thought of it, securities from family trusts created by his father-in-law. In early 1936, he went a step further. As a trustee of the New York Yacht Club, he also served as the club's treasurer and broker, keeping its bonds bond certificates in his firm's safe. He pledged $150,000 worth of club bonds as collateral for one of his bank loans. Almost exactly a year later, he repeated this criminal action, but with $657,000 worth of bonds and $221,000 cash from the previously mentioned stock exchange gratuity fund, where he was also the broker as well as trustee. Unlike the yacht club, the fund, the gratuity fund, the pension fund, normally kept its security certificates in its own safe and not in its brokers. 5 times over the spring and summer of 1937, a clerk at the fund requested of Whitney that he remit the certificates, and each time there was some excuse for delay. The clerk, whose salary at the time was $43.50 a week, later admitted that he saw Whitney as a boss and was intimidated by him. On the Monday before Thanksgiving, November 22nd, 1937, the fund trustees held their regularly scheduled meeting. Whitney did not attend, and it's the only meeting he ever missed. Perhaps taking advantage of Whitney's absence, the clerk informed the board that Whitney had not forwarded the fund certificates and cash in his possession. At the meeting's conclusion, the fund's president called a Whitney partner, Whitney's bond brokerage firm, who also knew nothing about any of this, but the partner promised delivery the next day. Whitney was caught. The next day, after unsuccessfully pleading for more delay due to paperwork pressures, he went to see his brother George at Morgan. George had a long history of making Richard loans that in recent years remained outstanding, several $1 million, maybe as much as 6. It was time for yet another one. Richard came right to the point. He had pledged securities of substantial value that belonged to the gratuity fund as collateral for a bank loan, and he had misappropriated considerable amounts of cash. As Richard later recalled the conversation, quote, he, that's George, was terribly disturbed and aghast that it could have been done and asked many, many times why I'd done it and just couldn't understand it, thunderstruck as he had reason to be. George remembered, quote, I asked him how he could have done it, and he said he had no explanation to offer. George committed to make an unsecured loan, if that is what you could call this, with no real possibility of repayment, of $1,082,000 for the entire amount needed to that needed to be returned to the fund. And normally, George would have withdrawn such an amount from his capital at the Morgan Partnership. But he couldn't do this without permission of the late Pierpont Morgan's son, Jack, who was in Europe. So instead, George borrowed the amount from Tom Lamont, the de facto chief executive of Morgan, with the understanding that Lamont would be paid back upon Jack's return from Europe. George told Lamont that his brother had misappropriated funds from some customer. The next morning, now Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Richard personally delivered the stolen securities and cash to the fund's president and clerk. Both these gentlemen later would testify that they assumed the long delay in this delivery was solely the result of office disorganization. 2 weeks later, Jack Morgan, back from Europe, gave George permission to withdraw the required funds from the partnership. George told Morgan, quote, Dick got into an awful jam in November, and I went to Tom Lamont when you were not here, and he loaned me the money. Later, Morgan said that he knew at the time that the awful jam must have been a business matter because the amount was so large. Thus it came to pass that in late 1937, 2 Morgan partners of great prominence knew specifically that Whitney was a criminal, and a third, an actual Morgan, had reason to suspect the same. None of these 3 chose to inform the law enforcement or exchange authorities. Their failure to act, particularly Tom Lamont's, would become a hotly debated issue a few months later at both the SEC and at the exchange. The SEC report on Whitney censured Lamont for, quote, a stubborn indifference to public responsibility, but it did not recommend any action be taken against any of the three Morgan partners for dereliction of duty. A similar decision by the exchange triggered the resignation from its board of Robert Hutchins, a recent public member and the president of the University of Chicago. Under pressure from his brother, Richard made efforts to sell his firm, but there were no takers. The firm's capital was mostly shares of distilled liquors, whose assets in turn consisted of about 550,000 gallons of Jersey Lightning brandy and about 1 million gallons of just plain cider. Rumors of Whitney's financial problems, not all accurate, began to make Wall Street rounds and finally led to the exchange conducting an on-premises examination of the firm. And on Saturday morning, March 5, 1938, Whitney was informed that the examination's conclusions. His firm was insolvent and he was guilty of embezzlement. Thus began a busy weekend. Whitney spent the afternoon trying to convince Charles Gay, his successor at the exchange, that he should not pursue charges against him. According to Gay, Whitney's reasoning was, quote, after all, I'm Richard Whitney. I mean the stock exchange to millions of people. As Gay later recalled, quote, I wouldn't say that Mr. Whitney was pleading. He assumed a more reasoning attitude, as if he were discussing somebody else than himself. And that as if he were discussing someone else than himself, I found through everyone I talked to in doing this research, that kind of a distance from disembodiment from the situation. From late Saturday afternoon until Sunday evening, there were a series of hurried meetings initiated by Whitney or Francis Barlow, the Morgan partner in charge of, in the absence of Lamont and George Whitney. They involved various lawyers and Morgan partners, and 2 trips by Barlow to Long Island's North Shore, one to meet with Jack Morgan and one to meet with John W. Davis, the 1924 Democratic presidential candidate who was of Davis Polk, who was the lawyer for Morgan. And Davis's advice was followed, and his advice was, don't do anything to help Whitney or risk being an accessory to a crime. Sunday evening, Barlow called George Whitney, who was in Florida. And according to Barlow, Mr. Whitney said, my God. It was a short endgame. On Monday, March 7th, the Exchange Business Conduct Committee, chaired, incidentally, by a man who had known both Whitney boys and remembered them, both Whitneys as boys, and remembered them as perfect snobs and pains in the neck, recommended that charges be brought. The next morning, the Exchange suspended Whitney and began the process of expulsion. The world watched as Whitney, with his usual distance and composure, admitted everything and assumed all responsibility. No whining, no pointing at others, no plea bargaining. His lawyer initially wanted him to plead not guilty, and he would not do it. He said, I am guilty. On Thursday, Whitney was indicted for misappropriation of securities from his father-in-law's trust, and the next day from the New York Yacht Club. And he insisted on assuming all responsibility, and it's interesting. He may have been a criminal, but he was also a gentleman. You get the sense, and a gentleman doesn't dissemble or lie, just embezzles. Whitey Bulger has some relevance to this. On April 11, sentencing day, in the family trust prosecution, which is the only one that was actually completed, a crowd of onlookers gathered outside of Whitney's house on 73rd Street. At 9, a liveried butler opened the front door, and Whitney and his lawyer departed for the courts. He had turned down offers from his wife and also his brother to accompany him. For the rest of the day, flowers from friends were delivered to the house to comfort Mrs. Whitney. The sentence was 5 to 10 years, although he only served 3 years, 4 months. Whitney spent the night after sentencing at the Tombs prison in Lower Manhattan. In the morning, handcuffed to a rapist on one side and an extortionist on another, he was taken to Grand Central Station for the train trip to Sing Sing. A crowd of 5,000 people waited to see him at the station, but to no avail, because he was brought through the baggage room right to the train. He entered prison, passing through a large group of reporters and photographers without any attempt to hide his face with clothing, as the other prisoners were doing, and I'll show you a picture of that. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, three-piece suit, and complete with the usual gold watch chain and porcelain club charm. By all accounts, Whitney was a model prisoner. He moved up from mop detail to teaching at the prison school and greeting new arrivals. Although 48 years old when he entered, he played first base on the prison school team with a mitt given him by Endicott Peabody, his old rotten headmaster. He was, quote, and this is hard to believe in today's context, all the guards and the prisoners all called him Mr. Whitney. The prisoners actually tipped their hats as they walked by him. The morning after his first night at prison, the loudspeaker announced, "Prisoners and Mr. Whitney assemble in the courtyard." I don't think it would happen today. Released for good behavior in 1941, Whitney would live for more than 3 decades, surviving his loyal wife and supportive brother. George would make good all his brother's failed loans and misappropriations. It took a while, but he did. After a few false starts in various businesses, Richard would end up as the treasurer of a local dairy in Far Hills, New Jersey, owned by his neighbor Clarence Dillon of Dillon Reed, and they live on a cottage on the estate. Although no longer part of the horse country gentry, the Whitneys did see children and grandchildren and a few old friends. In the tradition of his clan, he never discussed his past troubles with anyone that I could find. Mrs. Whitney instructed her daughter Appy never to talk about her father's situation with anyone ever. It was real denial. We're left with the question: why did he do it? I think if you read my book, I try to deal with some of that, but I don't think I answer it. But I would like to end the prepared remarks with the probation a little part of a probation officer's report written at the time Whitney was sentenced, which I think is amazingly insightful. He said, the probation officer, "Contributing factors to Whitney's delinquency are pride, obstinacy, unshakable belief in his own financial judgment, and a gambling instinct. Egotistical to a marked degree, it was apparently inconceivable that he, as a figure of national prominence in financial circles, and one whose judgment in economic matters was considered that of an expert, should prove a personal failure. Courage he possessed to an unusual degree. He also possessed a certain gentlemanly code of honor. Combined with this, he has a sustaining savoir-faire and a Spartan-like spirit of fortitude, which enables him to maintain unflinchingly his self-composure in the face of his present humiliating predicament." And what I would now like to do is just show you a few photographs, and then I would like to open up to discussion. This is Whitney in age 40, 1929, but when he was acting president of the exchange. And this is Whitney, the last picture when he was still president of the exchange, which would be 5 years later. You can see, if you just look at the two, you can see the aging process. This is Whitney right just before it all collapsed. He had 2 offices. He had a brokerage office, and he also had an office at the exchange. This was the cover of Time magazine in 1934 when he was riding high. This is the house his house on 73rd Street. It's still there. Oh, I'm sorry. Get closer. I'm sorry. This is the house on 73rd Street, and this is his place in New Jersey, which is also still there. This is Mr. and Mrs. Whitney in 1935 at a gay 90s costume horse show in Far Hills. The next year they actually separated, and there's a whole story to that which you'll have to buy the book to get. But they came back just before he went to prison. And Mrs. Whitney visited him, as far as I can tell, visited him regularly at prison, as did one daughter. The other daughter had nothing to do with him. This is Ferdinand Pecora, a very interesting guy, the product of the Tammany machine, the first assistant district attorney of Manhattan, became counsel to the Senate committee in 1932, and absolutely just exposed to the American public what was going on. And back when we had, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago, Chernow, I think, Ron Chernow had a column in the New York Times, and it was titled, "Where is our Ferdinand Pecora?" This is Whitney. There you can see. I must have looked at 300 pictures of Whitney, and they all have the Porcellian Club pig, except the very last, which I'll show you. That was obviously a very important thing for him. John O'Hara wrote a short story sort of about that. This was before the SEC, about 2 weeks after the whole thing went public. This is Gerhard Gesell, who later became a distinguished federal judge in Washington. He, at age 28, he's 28 then, he was the counsel for the SEC that was also, along with Ferdinand Pecora, very instrumental in laying out this whole thing. And he wrote a 3-volume report that was very helpful to me, anyone, a very capable young man. That's J.P. Morgan, who had to testify at the SEC about all this. And they asked him, "Did you know Richard Whitney?" And Morgan said, "I used to know Richard Whitney." Earlier, you may remember that earlier he testified in Washington for a Senate committee, and a public relations agent for a circus put a midget little girl on his lap. There's a picture of this. And Whitney actually shooed the man away. He was sitting behind. Now this is, if you can see, these two people are covering their faces, which is what was normally done. Whitney would not think of that. He never would pander to the public. I think it's an interesting picture. That's going into prison. And this is this is the only picture I have of him where he doesn't have the Porcellian pig, because he has a bow tie on. But this is his leaving prison. His brother came in a chauffeur-driven limousine to pick him up. The reporters noticed that they greeted each other coolly. And there's quite a bit of story about how the family relations after. Whitney went out, and then he realized he'd forgotten his clothing, and so he went back into prison and came back out. And the first thing he did after that was he was taken directly to his brother's in-laws' farm in Cape Cod, which he ran for a few months. And now I'd like to open it up to discussion. Yes, hi.
So there is a real stark contrast between the brothers Whitney. You having a personal insight on the two of them, what was the real difference between the two of them?
It's interesting. I don't know that I can answer that. George was more successful. Richard's obituary was longer, but that was George was more, George at one point was the Morgan practice, going back to the original Jack Morgan, was to put a member of his executive group on every corporate board that borrowed money from Morgan. And I think George at one point was on the board of 17 different corporations, all major corporations. And he was given an honorary degree by Harvard. He was more distinguished. And in the audience, Charlie Scribner's in the audience, and one of his grandfathers was a Davis Polk partner, very involved in this, who I guess reported to the family that he thought that Richard was consumed with jealousy over his brother's success. I have not picked that up from others. I didn't, and I talked to both Richard Whitney's daughters and didn't get anything. I don't know. I think you'd almost have to go back and know more about the parents and the upbringing. It is true that Richard followed George in almost everything. I mean, college, club, business, lifestyle. It's really an interesting question. Cain and Abel. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Both of you, go ahead. You first, go ahead.
We use the term greed today to define a good portion of what this seems to represent. Was that one of the things that was pushing him, or was it just that he couldn't fail?
He certainly, enjoyed a high lifestyle, and that was important to him. And I guess I don't know how you divide how much of his fall was because he was a terrible investor, and how much of his fall was because he spent too much. It's hard to do that. He felt he was entitled to a lot. There's no question about that. I have trouble answering beyond that. I don't know. Joe, did you?
Yeah, I don't know this gentleman till today, but I think you described him as coming from not humble but modest background. Where did he get this sense of entitlement from?
You have to realize that you can come to New York and create yourself, and that's what people have done for 350 years. I quote in my book, in F. Scott Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise, Amory, the Fitzgerald character, is amazed to discover that the most aristocratic member of his class at Princeton was the son of a store clerk who made a fortune in Tacoma real estate. And I think the Whitneys were an old family, but they were not wealthy. But they came to New York, and they were Boston Brahmins. I don't think they're the only people to do that. I think that's part of the story of America. I don't know. They were eighth cousins to the. I think if I did figure it out right, Richard Whitney was an eighth cousin of Jock Whitney, the very wealthy, whose family built the subways, and they're also distantly related to Eli Whitney, the cotton gin. Yeah.
Was the family supportive of your efforts here? How do they view the book today?
I went out in the rain to Far Hills, New Jersey, to see the 92-year-old youngest daughter, and I was shown by two servants into she'd married a very rich man, into the library, and then she came down, and I started to apologize for who am I to do this, and she said, "Malcolm," she said, "stop." She said, and then she said, I mentioned in my talk, my mother said when my father had his troubles, the whole family talked about troubles, I'd never talked to anyone ever about this, and she said that was a great mistake. And for 2.5 hours she proceeded to tell me what it was like to be 19 years old, have your father go to prison, lose all your money. Another grandson of George told me that when he was a boy, it was understood that you never talked about Richard Whitney at family gatherings. And in fact, Mrs. George Whitney, that was a rule in her house. You couldn't talk about Richard Whitney. But this grandson told me that nowadays, when the family gets together, all they want to do is talk about Richard, and they can't wait for my book. So time may ease some of that problem. Yes.
Malcolm,
Joey.
There's something. To me, the heart of this book, the mystery, which is why he did it, or how a man that had such a sense of rectitude didn't hide his face, admitted everything, how he did this. And the one thing I want to ask your feedback on this. When you describe the various positions he held, he was master of hounds in Far Hills, where my family grew up. And I remember in my father's memoir about his childhood in Far Hills during this period of the 20s and 30s, he described property as quote-unquote loosely held. And what he meant by that was in Far Hills, in this circle, it was understood that if you were in the neighborhood and you wanted a drink, I'd walk into Malcolm's house and ask for a drink, and the butler would give me a drink. If I wanted to borrow your horse to go out hunting, I'd go to the stable and say, I want to borrow this horse. And I wonder if that attitude, I mean, that in a way defines entitlement. I wonder if that loosely held attitude with regard to personal property at home and horses and the like could have spilled over into, I'm the treasurer of the yacht club, I'm really in charge. I mean, there's not a great difference between my money and their money. It's going to come back. You see what I'm saying?
It's so interesting. I don't know where to start on that. Let me, if I had to give one word what caused the problem, it was arrogance. I've talked to a number of trial lawyers who talk about how people take little steps down and then they can't get back. I don't think it's the case with Whitney. I mean, Whitney actually could have sold distilled liquors at 45 and paid almost everybody but his brother back. Louis Auchincloss wrote the novel The Embezzler about this. And I was able to have lunch with Louis Auchincloss before he died. And what surprised me about Louis Auchincloss's attitude to Richard Whitney, Auchincloss had also gone to Groton. He knew him, but not well. He was much younger. Was that he wasn't upset by Richard being a crook. I think he said, I know lots of crooks. He was upset by his living so high, that a Groton boy shouldn't live so high, which would be in a way contradictory to what you're saying. I don't know what caused all this. Both brothers lived very high. George had a 113-foot yacht and things like that. And the father, who started as a clerk at 17, was one of 12 children. The youngest of those ends up going to Harvard, class of 1871, and after 20 years living in India and also working in New York and in Boston, he becomes a Morgan partner. And he's the guy that created the entree to Morgan for both the boys, and he lived very high. So there was something in the family about living high. I don't, you know.
Sort of away from Whitney, the New York Stock Exchange had evolving self-governance standards during this period. Do you think that this situation, these troubles, were a real test for it in establishing its...
Well, what surprised me, I was surprised, the man, the prominent figure who knew there was trouble before the crash was Herbert Hoover. And Whitney had worked for $1 a year when he was a young man in the administration that Hoover ran, the food administration. He knew Hoover. And at least 3 times while Hoover was still president, Whitney went to White House, had dinner with him, and each time Hoover asked Whitney to get the stock exchange to cut back on margin trading and things like that, and each time he didn't. And in Hoover's memoirs, he talks about how Richard Whitney wouldn't do what I asked him to do, which I thought was really fascinating. Hoover's problem was he didn't think the government should do it. Until at least by 1932, he's up for re-election. He's losing. It looks like he's going to lose. He then starts thinking government maybe ought to force change on the stock exchange, but not until then. It's very interesting. FDR comes in and has no problem with that.
So the case, though, the stock exchange fraud against Whitney, it sounded like they got pushed to the wall and they had to finally start.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. William McChesney Martin becomes the first paid full-time president of the stock exchange, and he later became head of the Federal Reserve, and he's responsible for a lot of the corrections. Yeah.
The trouble with arrogance as an explanation is that arrogance is a result, not a cause. So one then begs the question, if you will, is that what led to the arrogance or the particular manifestations of arrogance that we found here. And so I think the questions still are there. I guess I may have to buy the book.
Well, you know, let me just say a couple of things. This may be a little risky, but there is, in the old Puritan tradition, a kind of New England exceptionalism, reading Endicott Peabody, the head of Groton's sermons, you get a little of this feeling that there's a sense of superiority to that clan. I think maybe that, you know, that snob comes from sina nobilitata, not nobility. I think maybe the Whitneys in Boston were upwardly mobile, and that may have created some of this too. I don't know. It's very interesting. Yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and for those who would like to buy it, it is on sale now in the back. Impeccable Connections. Thanks again.
Thank you.
It's terrific.
Thank you.
You're watching American History TV.